She said something sharp in front of people, or maybe just to you, and something in you went quiet. Not because you had nothing to say, but because something about the moment felt wrong in a way you couldn't immediately name. The words landed, you absorbed them, and then life moved on, but the moment didn't leave you. It stayed somewhere just beneath the surface, the way certain things do when they haven't been fully understood. Here is what I want you to consider. That moment, the one you're thinking of right now, was not random. It was not simply cruelty or carelessness or a bad day finding an easy target. It carried something inside it, a signal, a message that was never delivered clearly because the woman sending it did not know how to send it any other way. Most men never see this, not because they aren't paying attention, but because they are looking at the wrong thing. They are reading the surface of what was said instead of the architecture underneath it. By the end of this video, that changes. You are going to understand what female belittling behavior actually communicates at a psychological level, how to read which version of it you are dealing with, and what that knowledge means for how you carry yourself going forward. The answer is quieter than you expect, and it changes everything. It is not always loud. Sometimes it is a single sentence delivered so casually that you almost let it pass. Almost. Think back to a moment like this. Maybe it happened at a dinner table with other people present, and she said something that diminished you so lightly it barely registered until you were driving home. Or maybe it happened privately, just the two of you, and the sharpness of it was somehow worse for having no audience. Either way, you felt it. That particular quality of being made smaller by someone whose opinion of you, whether you admit it or not, actually matters to you. What makes this kind of moment different from ordinary criticism is not just the content, it is the texture of it. Regular feedback, even unwelcome feedback, tends to be directional. It points at something specific, something improvable. But belittling doesn't do that. Belittling doesn't point at a problem you can fix. It points at you, at something fundamental. And that is why it lands differently. That particular sting, the one that lingers, exists because it bypasses the part of your mind that evaluates information and goes straight to the part that holds your sense of self. And here is what almost no one tells you, that targeting is almost never conscious on her part. She is not sitting across from you thinking about psychological mechanisms. She is doing something far more instinctive. She is communicating the only way she currently knows how, about something she may not even be able to name clearly herself. That is where this actually starts. The first thing most men do with this kind of behavior is reach for an explanation that protects their ego. And that is exactly the explanation that keeps them stuck. The two most common readings are these. The first, she disrespects me. The second, she is trying to control me. And here is the difficult truth. Both of those readings contain a fragment of accuracy, but neither one is the full picture. And the part they miss is the part that matters most. When a man decides that belittling equals disrespect, he responds in one of two ways. He either retreats, goes quiet, goes cold, distances himself, or he escalates, defending his position, counterattacking, trying to win something that was never actually a competition. Neither response reaches what is actually happening. Both responses are reactions to the surface, and the surface in these moments is almost always misleading. The same problem exists with the control interpretation. Yes, there are situations where a pattern of diminishment is about control, but applying that framework universally causes a man to misread situations where something very different and in some ways more solvable is actually at play. What both interpretations share is that they make her the subject and you the object. She is doing something to you. You are receiving it. That framing, as understandable as it is, removes your ability to see the dynamic clearly. The more accurate framework is harder to reach, but once you have it, you cannot unsee it. Belittling, in most cases, is not a statement about you. It is a broadcast about her, a displaced one that has been rerouted through criticism because the original signal had nowhere else to go. Here is what took me a long time to understand. When a woman thuds a man down, she is almost never talking about what she appears to be talking about. What psychology has observed across decades of research into relational communication and emotional behavior is that people, women in particular, though not exclusively, will frequently externalize an unmet internal need as criticism directed outward. This is called displaced emotional expression. In plain terms, it means the thing she is saying is not the thing she is feeling. The feeling is real, the target is wrong, and the form it takes, sharpness, diminishment, a well-placed comment that quietly reduces you, is not chosen deliberately. It is the shape that unexpressed emotional pressure takes when it has been held too long without a release valve. There are 3 unmet needs that most commonly produce this behavior. Not always, context always matters here, and we will come back to the exceptions. But in the majority of cases, one of these 3 things is underneath it. The first is emotional invisibility. When a woman feels consistently unseen, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, cumulative way of 1,000 small moments where she felt like background, the frustration of that builds. She does not have language for it that feels safe to use directly. Saying, "I feel invisible to you," requires a vulnerability that many women, particularly in relationships where that vulnerability has not been met well before, will not risk. So the feeling finds another exit, and it comes out sideways, as a comment about how you handled something, as a remark about a choice you made, as something that sounds like criticism of your competence, but is actually a cry about connection. The second unmet need is feeling unprotected, not physically, emotionally. There is a baseline sense of security that women seek from the men they are close to, a feeling that someone is paying attention, that someone would notice if something were wrong, that they are not navigating everything alone. When that feeling is absent for long enough, something changes in how she communicates. The edge that enters her voice is not aggression, it is a test, sent in the only language currently available, asking whether you are paying attention. The third is feeling like a low priority, not in terms of schedules or logistics, but in the deeper sense of mattering, of being someone whose inner world registers with you. When a woman reaches this place, her communication often shifts into something that looks like contempt from the outside, but reads at its root as a kind of grief about the distance. These 3 are not identical. They do not call for the same response. And learning to tell them apart is exactly what comes next. 3 women can say the exact same cutting remark, and each one means something completely different. The words are identical, the psychology is not. This is the part most conversations about this topic completely skip over, and skipping it is expensive because a misreading here doesn't just fail to solve the problem, it makes it worse. The first type is what I would call the cry for closeness. This is the woman who has grown emotionally distant from you, not because she wants to be, but because the connection between you has thinned somewhere along the way, and neither of you formally acknowledged it. The belittling that comes from this place tends to happen specifically in moments of potential intimacy, when you are physically close, when a conversation could go somewhere real. She says something that punctures the moment, and you pull back and the distance increases. What you do not see is that the puncturing was involuntary. She is not trying to push you away. She is terrified of reaching toward you and finding nothing there. The friction is not rejection. It is fear wearing the costume of rejection. The observable markers here are contrast and timing. Pay attention to when the sharpness appears. If it clusters around moments that could have been warm, around vulnerability, around closeness, around anything that requires both people to show up emotionally, that pattern is meaningful. One instance means very little. A pattern across multiple situations is something else entirely. The second type is the test of strength. This one is harder to sit with, but it is important to understand. Some women, particularly those who have been in situations where the men around them were emotionally unreliable, who collapsed under pressure, who went defensive, who needed management, will unconsciously probe a man's psychological solidity by applying friction and watching what happens. The belittling here is not truly personal, it is structural. She is not expressing a view about your inadequacy. She is running a check on whether you can hold yourself steady when someone pushes. The man who becomes reactive, who argues, who withdraws into sulking, who needs reassurance, confirms the fear. The man who stays grounded, warm but unshaken, does something she genuinely was not expecting. You will recognize this type by its quality of challenge rather than expression. The remark doesn't feel like something overflowing. It feels like something being thrown to see if you'll catch it or flinch. The third type looks identical on the surface to the first two, but it is different, and the difference matters enormously. This is actual contempt, not a display signal, not a test. Contempt, in the psychological sense, is a state of fundamental negative evaluation of another person. A settled view that the person is beneath what you deserve, incapable, unworthy of your regard. It looks like belittling because it is. The research on this, particularly in the study of long-term relationship stability, is unambiguous. Contempt is one of the most reliable predictors of relationship deterioration. It is not something that resolves through better communication or more patience on your part. We will come back to how you tell the difference. But first, there is a layer to this dynamic that almost no one reaches. And it is the one that changes everything about how you stand in these moments. The sentence she said, that is not where the communication ends. That is where it begins. Remember what I told you at the start, that there was something happening in this dynamic that most men never see. We are at it now. In the first two types, the cry for closeness and the test of strength, the moment a woman delivers a belittling remark, she is not finished. Something else begins immediately. She begins watching. Not consciously, not with a clipboard, but somewhere beneath the surface of whatever she says next, however she moves through the next few minutes, she is registering exactly how you respond. This is not manipulation. It is something older and more instinctive than that. It is the emotional nervous system doing what it does, reading the environment, calibrating safety, assessing whether the person in front of her can be trusted to hold steady. What she is watching for is not a comeback, not a correction, not proof that you are right and she was unfair. What she is watching for, in the case of the cry for closeness, is whether you stay, whether the sharpness of the moment causes you to emotionally exit, to go cold, to distance, to signal that your presence is conditional on her being pleasant. And what she is watching for in the test of strength is whether you are actually as solid as you seemed, or whether that was a performance that falls apart under the mildest pressure. The man who becomes defensive, who argues the point, who explains at length why the remark was inaccurate, who needs to win, confirms a fear she already had. The man who goes quiet and wounded confirms a different one. The man who absorbs the moment, stays warm, does not make it a referendum on either of them, and continues being present, that response lands in a place inside her she was not prepared for. A calibrated response, to be clear, is not a tactic. It is not a game. It is not performed indifference designed to confuse her. It is simply the behavior of a man who knows who he is clearly enough that a sharp word does not change it. He might acknowledge the remark quietly, without drama, or he might let it pass without commentary. What he does not do is hand the moment more weight than it deserves. He does not collapse, he does not retaliate, he does not disappear. That response, simple, grounded, almost unremarkable from the outside, is the most disorienting thing she can encounter, because it answers a question she was asking without knowing she was asking it. Everything we have covered is true, and there are situations where none of it applies, and you need to know the difference. The framework I have described, belittling as displaced communication, as a cry for closeness or a test of strength, applies when certain conditions are present, and it does not apply when they are absent. Treating a contempt pattern as a hidden signal is one of the most costly mistakes a man can make, not because it harms the relationship, but because it harms him. It keeps him extending interpretive generosity to a situation that does not call for it and will not reward it. Here is how you tell the difference. Frequency matters. A pattern of consistent escalating diminishment, one that does not reduce when you show up more warmly, one that actually intensifies when you are at your steadiest, is not a displaced signal. A signal responds to the right answer. Contempt does not. It simply continues. Public versus private consistency matters too. The woman who is sharper in front of others than she is when the two of you are alone is communicating something different than the woman who is equally cutting regardless of who is in the room. The first has something to do with an audience. The second has something to do with how she actually regards you. And responsiveness to engagement matters most of all. If you have at any point tried genuine calm presence, not as a strategy but as an honest attempt to stay connected, and the sharpness continued without change, without any visible softening, without any moment where the layer beneath it showed itself, pay attention to that. A displaced signal, when met with the right kind of presence, eventually reveals what it was hiding. Contempt has nothing underneath it to reveal. If what you are dealing with falls into this last category, the framework is not the answer. Clarity is. And clarity begins with being willing to see what is actually in front of you. Most men spend years trying to figure out the right thing to say in that moment. The answer almost always is less than they think. This is the insight that closes everything we have been building toward, and it is the one I deliberately held until now, because without everything that came before it, it sounds like passivity. It is not. A man who has never been cut down and responded with complete groundedness has never truly been tested in that moment. Not because he lacks intelligence or awareness, but because the natural human response to being diminished is to either defend or withdraw. Both feel like the right move. Neither is. Defending, explaining why the remark was inaccurate, arguing the point, listing evidence of your competence, assumes that the remark was about what it appeared to be about. We have already established that it almost never is. You are arguing against a surface, and the thing underneath it remains completely untouched. Withdrawing, going quiet in a way that signals hurt. Pulling back your warmth, making yourself emotionally unavailable for the hours or days that follow, gives the moment more power than it deserves. It also confirms in both the cry for closeness and the test of strength the exact fear that produced the remark in the first place. What remains is something quieter. Not silence, not the frozen silence of someone suppressing a reaction, but the natural calm of someone who registered what was said, took it in, decided it did not require a realignment of who he is, and continued. A man who can do that in real time, not as a performance, but as an expression of genuine self-possession, does something to the dynamic that nothing else does. He answers a question she was sending without consciously sending it. And the question was never really about what she said. It was this: Are you actually here? Are you solid enough that I don't have to be careful with you? Can I trust that your presence doesn't disappear the moment I'm less than easy? The man who answers that question without words, without drama, simply by staying, gives her something she may not have expected to receive. And he gives himself something too. He gives himself back the room he was in the middle of leaving. What you now understand, having watched this all the way through, is something that cannot be unlearned. When a woman uses sharpness to diminish you, there is almost always more beneath it than the surface suggests. There is an unmet need that found the wrong exit. There is a fear looking for an answer. There is a test being run that most men fail, not because they are inadequate, but because they never knew it was happening. The three types are different. The cry for closeness, the test of strength, the genuine exception. They each call for something different from you, but they share one thing. They all respond to a man who knows where he stands. Not a man who performs confidence, not a man who weaponizes calmness. A man who is simply, quietly, fully present, and whose presence does not depend on the moment being comfortable. You do not need to overanalyze every sharp word from this point forward. You do not need to run calculations in real time or turn every exchange into a psychological exercise. What you need is simply to recognize the pattern when it appears, to resist the two instinctive responses that do not work, and to let your steadiness speak for itself. That steadiness, it turns out, is its own kind of communication, and she will feel it before you say a word. I want to ask you something, and I read every comment that comes in. Tell me, has there been a moment where you understood, looking back, that something she said sharply was actually about something else entirely? What did you see when you looked closer? On this channel, we keep going deeper into these dynamics because the men who understand them carry themselves differently. Subscribe if you want to keep building that understanding, and stay close because in the next video, I am going to show you what a woman's silence after an argument is actually communicating, because almost every man reads it backwards, and what it really means will change how you move in those moments completely.